Now, the essay Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory, can be looked at in detail. So she begins with the realm of philosophy, how performance is looked up in philosophy. Philosophers do not see the theatrical acting as such. Instead, they are looking at discursive acts. They look at the act as a discourse, like speech act, the phenomenological theory of acts, which was propounded by Edmund Husserl. How they seek to explain the agents constitute social reality through language, through gesture, and all these symbolic social signs. So, philosophers look at act not in its theatrical aspect, but as discourse. And then she takes up Simone de Beauvoir and her claim one is not born but rather becomes a woman, and take up this particular verb becomes. How this particular quote appropriated and reinterpreted the doctrine of constituting acts from phenomenological tradition. See, when Simone de Beauvoir claimed that a woman is becoming a woman, an individual becomes a woman, that becoming, the act of becoming is taken from the phenomenological tradition of becoming. And we know that gender is an unstable identity. That is what, you know, that is what she comes up with, Judith Butler. And it is an identity tenuously constituted in time. It is an identity which is instituted, not even constituted. She says instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. We saw how performance is repetition of acts, and here she is talking about stylized repetition of acts. How? How is it done? Through bodily gestures, through movements, through enactments of various kinds which constitute an abiding gendered self. So right from the beginning, right from the childhood of a girl through her life, until she becomes a grandmother or someone like that, there is always an enactment of the abiding gendered self. That person will conform to a particular framework which is expected of her. Therefore, we need to look at gender as something that requires a conception of constituted social temporality. Gender should be looked up as something which is created, something which is socially constituted, something which is socially instituted. So she is talking about the aim of the article in the first two paragraphs itself. She says how she wishes to show the ways in which reified and naturalized conception of gender is understood as constituted, and hence this reified and naturalized conception of gender can be constituted different ways too. And these constituting acts as not only constitutes the idea of the actor but as constituting that particular identity as a compelling illusion, as something in which you believe in, as something in which you cannot escape, rather than fall into that belief. So we believe the roles we play out in life. And reification is about making it into a thing. Reification is a word which came from Marxism. It is a process by which social relations are perceived as inherent attributes of people who are involved in them, or attributes of some product of the relation, such as traded commodity. So in short, Reification is about the subject which is objectified, where the object is active and determining, whereas the subject is not. And Butler also uses phenomenology to show what is called gender identity is nothing but a performative accomplishment which is constituted, compelled by social sanction and taboo. And what she looks at is the very character or the very characteristic of gender as performative, and therefore how the possibility of contesting this particular character through its reified status. The first part is titled Sex slash Gender, Feminist and Phenomenological Views. Here she speaks about two people. She quotes them, Merleau-Ponty as well as Simone de Beauvoir. Merleau-Ponty's reflections in the phenomenology of perception in the essay The Body in its Sexual Being, he takes up the issue with such accounts of bodily experience, and then he comes up with a claim. And what is the claim? Body is a historical idea, not a natural entity. And it is the same claim which Simone de Beauvoir cites in the second sex when she readies the stage for her claim that woman, and by extension any gender, is a historical situation rather than a natural entity. So these two people speak of body, speak of the gender in the same way. Now, feminist theory has often been critical about the naturalistic explanation of sex and sexuality, which assume that the meaning of social existence comes from her physiology. So, anatomy is destiny. That is what Freud said, right? And what these people say, both Simone de Beauvoir and Merleau-Ponty, what they contend is that body comes to bear cultural meanings. Body is a site where the active process of embodying certain cultural and historical possibilities are carried out rather than a natural, you know, a biological entity. Body is a site, S-I-T-E, where the active process of cultural and historical possibilities are embodied. Okay, and it's not easy to understand this because it's a complicated process. It's a complicated process of appropriation. Okay, meaning here is performed and enacted. Okay, and these acts almost resemble the performative acts which are happening in theatrical context, but here it is looked at in a different way. Let us see how. As far as Merleau-Ponty is concerned, body is, I remember telling you, it's a historical idea. But it is not just a historical idea, rather it's a set of possibilities. Body is a set of possibilities. Gender is a set of possibilities to be continually realized, to be continually actualized. Okay, and these possibilities are necessarily constrained by the available historical conventions. So these possibilities will not be the same in 18th century as well as in 20th century. There will be differences. Okay, and the body, it's not a self-identical or merely a factic materiality. It's not an embodiment of facts and its materiality. It is nothing but a materiality which bears meaning. Meaning of what sort? Cultural meanings. The manner of this bearing is actually fundamentally dramatic. So that is where the performativity is coming. That is where the theatricality is coming. So body is a actualization site What does it actualize? There is a continual and incessant, non-stop materializing of possibilities which are determined as well as constrained by the available historical conventions. Now, what does that mean? The I, which is its body, is of necessity. It's a body of embodying. That is what a body does, right? Body embodies something. And what does it embody? It embodies possibilities. And as an intentionally organized materiality, because now we are speaking of body as a site of structure. The body is always an embodying of possibilities which are conditioned and circumscribed. This is actually slightly oxymoron because it's a set of possibilities determined as well as circumscribed by historical conventions. Okay, the body is a historical situation as Simone de Beauvoir also claims, and it is a manner of doing, the manner of dramatizing, the manner of reproducing the historical situation of those particular societies. Now, what do we need to look next? To do, to dramatize, to reproduce. These were the two verbs, two actions I just spoke. Now to do all these three acts, there seem to be some sort of an elementary structure. We need to structure these acts, right? So we are looking at structures of embodiment. Body embodies possibilities, and by doing, dramatizing, reproducing certain possibilities, certain possibilities through the societal consent. But this process of embodiment carries structure. Embodiment clearly manifests a set of strategies, or what Sartre would perhaps call a style of being, or how Foucault will call as a stylistics of existence. So these are the phrases she quotes from Sartre as well as Foucault. Stylistics of existence, as well as Foucault was concerned, is not about stylization of conduct or more simply as lifestyle. Please don't look at it in that way. The main aim should be how to free the self from the limits of life. That is how Foucault used it. He was trying to transgress the limit of humanism, okay? And that is not exactly how Judith Butler is taking up gender here, embodiment here, or stylistics of existence here. Here, gender is taken as a corporeal style which carry the double meaning. The double meaning of dramatic, that is theatrical, and non-referential. That is what happens on stage, right? There is an act of non-referential performativity happening there. Now, sex versus gender, that is the division which we always speak of. Simone de Beauvoir underscores the distinction between sex as a biological facticity, as a biological materiality, and gender as a cultural interpretation or signification of the biological facticity of sex. In plain terms, sex is biological, gender is social. But look at the way it is constructed. Gender is signification of the biological spasticity called sex. Now, the question remains, to be a woman or to become a woman? So we are not speaking of the ontological identity of womanhood. That is why she says, more than being, the act of becoming is favored, because gender is performed. So the act of becoming the woman gains prominence today. It's a cultural sign. To materialize oneself in obedience to a historically limited possibility as well as historically delimited possibility. That is the task. Hence, becoming a woman becomes a project. It becomes a sustained and repeated corporeal project. And what happens in this particular project? Compelling the body to conform to a particular historical idea of woman. Now, gender is to be looked at as a project here. When you speak of a project, the project will have aim and objective, right? What is the objective here? The survival of a particular culture. Okay, and any project will have a strategy, methodology, isn't it? And when you look at it, there are people who contest it. There are people who fail in this. So those who fail to do their gender correctly, they are regularly punished. I have already furnished the details in the class. So gender is a construction which regularly conceals its genesis. No one will speak of how this whole construction of gender came into being. We will look at how the construction went on, in its synthesis. That's all. But the genesis is completely forgotten. So the authors of gender, the people who resort to this gender identity, its performativity, all these authors of gender, they become entranced by their own stories so much that their construction compels them to believe in the necessity of this construction called gender as well as its naturalness. Okay, now how phenomenology intervenes. How phenomenology, the discipline, the school of thought, intervenes in this particular study. I hope you remember how the basic tenet of phenomenology is the maxim, let the object narrates its own autobiography, isn't it? So the personal becomes an expansive category. It is widened, one which accommodates, if only implicitly, some political structures which are usually viewed as public. So personal becomes political, personal becomes public. The suggestion is that the body becomes its gender. How? Through a series of acts which are renewed, revised, and consolidated through time. From a feminist point of view, one might try to reconceive the gendered body as the legacy of sedimented acts. So, this making of gender, the actualization of all these gender acts, they should be looked at as sedimentation, the process of sedimentation, rather than a predetermined or a foreclosed structure. We are not thrown into being woman. Okay, the womanhood is not thrown into existence. It's not predetermined. Rather, it carries the legacy of sedimentation. There is always an action of sedimentation. Okay, and rather than a predetermined or foreclosed structure, essence or fact, whether natural or cultural or linguistic, one might reconceive the gendered body as a sedimentation process of culturally sanctioned acts. Now there is ambiguity as well. The feminist appropriation of the phenomenological theory of constitution, how it employs the notion of act, it's actually ambiguous, because if a personal is category, it's a category which expands to include the wider political and social structures, then the acts of gendered subject would similarly be expansive, and anything can be done in the name of this particular gender, this particular category. So the acts of women versus acts in the name of women poses problems. Now, it has got downsides as well. To be a woman means to be in an oppressed position always. And it provides a false ontological promise of an eventual political solidarity. There is a promise, there is a hope. Now, feminists also run the risk of rendering visible a category which may or may not be representative of the concrete lives of women, the concrete lives of actual lived women. Now the second part is titled Binary Genders and the Heterosexual Contract. She used the word contract here, heterosexual contract. She is speaking about heteronormativity, how the binary genders work, have been working and still work. And as Foucault and others point out, the association of a natural sex with a discrete gender, with a natural attraction to the opposite sex or opposite gender, is actually an unnatural conjunction of cultural constructs in the service of reproductive interests. As I told you, gender is a project, it has a purpose, it has a strategy, and the reproductive interest of a culture is its aim, and for which there has always been a naturalization of this thing called attraction to opposite sex, attraction to opposite gender. And what she says is, it's actually an unnatural conjunction. It's not there right from the beginning. It was created. And she speaks further about heteronormativity. Levi-Strauss, he has shown how the incest taboo works. To do what? To guarantee the channeling of sexuality into various modes of heterosexual marriage, nothing else, nothing beyond heterosexuality. The sexual energy is channeled only through heterosexuality, nothing more than that. One way in which this system of compulsory heterosexuality is reproduced as well as concealed. How is it done? Through the cultivation of bodies into discrete sexes with natural appearances, natural heteronormativity positions or natural heterosexual dispositions. So the female should be like this, the male should be like this, or everyone should fall into these two categories alone. That is where the mechanization works. That is how the system of compulsory heterosexuality is ensured. That is how the status quo is maintained. The contention that sex, gender, and heterosexuality are historical products which have become conjoined and reified as natural over time. Now, this is a maxim, this is a concept, this is a contention, an argument which was received by worldwide critics like Michel Foucault and others. And many characters, many theoreticians, many philosophers, many critics in the recent years, they have taken up this contention. What is the contention? That sex and gender and heterosexuality, they are all not natural but historical products which became conjoined and reified as natural through time, over time. But they don't speak of the cultural sedimentation of sexuality, which is actually the contention of Judith Butler in this entire essay. She says gender is nothing but a sedimentation. It's the byproduct of a sedimentation of performative acts. Now, can phenomenology assist a feminist reconstruction of a sedimented character of sex, gender, and sexuality? Where? At the level of the body. Here is where phenomenology is explicated further. Okay, the formulation of body. It is looked at as a mode of dramatizing or enacting possibilities, and this formulation offers a way to understand how a cultural convention is embodied, how a cultural convention is enacted. Now, theatrical sense of act. It forces a revision of the individualistic assumptions which underlies the restricted view of constituted acts within phenomenological discourses. The act, which gender is, the act that embodies agents are in as much as dramatic and actively embodying, and indeed they wear cultural significations, cultural meanings in such a way that it is not one's individual acts alone. The individual's doing of one's gender, even though it is individualistic at that particular moment, it is not a fully individual matter. It is culturally sanctioned, it is socially sanctioned, and hence it was a process which took place, which had been taking place even before the coming in of that particular individual. So, in what sense gender is an act? We have already seen in the previous essay through repetition. This repetition is at once a reenactment as well as a re-experiencing of a set of meanings which are already socially established. We just enact and reenact and can go on enacting the predetermined acts. And it is the mundane and the ritualized form of legitimization or their legitimation. She quotes Victor Turner. The gendered body acts its part in a culturally restricted space and enact the interpretation within the confines of already existing directives. So there is no way we cross the borders. There is no way we transcend the boundaries. Now, when you speak of boundaries, you should think of theatre. In theatre, there is a clear distinction between the act and the life. But here, in actual lives, gender has been stabilized, gender has been polarized, gender has been rendered discrete and intractable. It cannot be called back, it cannot be erased, it cannot be rendered invalid. So, gender is made to comply with a certain model of truth and falsity. That is the polarity we are speaking of. So, in a way, it contradicts its own performative fluidity, but then it serves the social policy. What is the social policy? That of gender regulation and gender control. So, if you perform your gender wrong, it will initiate a set of punishments. You can look at the social media for innumerous examples of people who perform their gender wrong and how they are punished. Sometimes they are obvious, sometimes they are indirect. And performing it well will provide reassurance that there is essentialized gender identity after all. When you perform the gender in accordance with the certified manner, there is the assurance, there is the reassurance that gender is essentialized. And when you perform it wrong, there is punishments. The truth or falsity of gender is only socially compelled, and in no sense it is ontologically necessitated by nature, by its character itself. Gender is not, divided into true or false. Gender is not polarized. It is the social, practices which make it look like a polarized entity. The third part is called feminist theory beyond an expressive model of gender. So she proposes the third phase. She proposes a transcending of expressive model of gender. And she begins with saying that it is one thing to use the term and understanding, keeping its ontological insufficiency. When you call a person by the term woman, immediately we are aware of its ontological insufficiency. And it is quite another thing to articulate a normative vision for a feminist theory which celebrates or emancipates an essence, which emancipate a nature or a shared cultural reality, which unfortunately cannot be found. Why? Because it was created, it was constituted, it is fluid, gender is fluid, right? So the phenomenon of a man's or a woman's point of view, it's nothing but socially constituted phenomenon. So what she tries in this essay is exposing, deconstructing or reconstructing the presuppositions of the category of women itself, which requires a critical genealogy of complex and institutional as well as discursive means. So she is not looking at the emancipation of women, the category of women. She says you have to look at the institutional and the discursive means by which woman itself is constituted. And the conclusion she gives can be given in three different sentences. So the conclusion is like this. She says, I envision the critical genealogy of gender to rely on a phenomenological set of presuppositions. Most important among them, the expanded conception of an act, which is socially shared and historically constituted, and which is performative in the sense I previously prescribed, not in the generally understood sense. So, the gender in its critical genealogy should rather rest on a phenomenological background of act which is historically and socially constituted, the act which is performative but not in the general sense. And her concern is that sexual difference not become a reification which unwittingly preserves some sort of a binary restriction on gender identity and an implicit heterosexual framework for the description of gender, gender identity and sexuality. So the sexual difference they speak of naturally or unknowingly reifies the preservation of binary restrictions, and that should be taken into account. Now gender, it's not passively scripted on the body, and it's not determined by nature and language and symbolic or the overwhelming history of patriarchy. Why? Because gender is what is put on like a dress, invariably, under constraint, daily, incessantly, either with anxiety or pleasure. Gender is performative acts. It's a continuous process. It is something we just put on. There is no essentialized meaning to gender.